You know, before I tell you this story that completely changed my life, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever been judged unfairly, if you've ever had people assume the worst about you without knowing the real truth, then hit that like button right now. Because what I'm about to share with you is going to shake you to your core. This isn't just another story about rich people and drama. This is about how sometimes the universe has a way of revealing who people really are when it matters most. It's about how love can be found in the most unexpected places, and how the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how many people try to bury it. I'm Sarah, and 3 years ago, I was just another single mom struggling to make ends meet, working double shifts, counting every penny, trying to give my little girl Emma the life she deserved. I never imagined that a chance encounter at a small-town diner would lead me into a world of billion-dollar fortunes, family secrets, and a love so real it would survive even death itself. But here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. The people in this story, the ones who called me terrible names and tried to destroy my reputation, they're going to get exactly what they deserve. And when that moment comes, when karma finally catches up with them, you're going to feel it in your bones. You're going to see why I believe that true love really can conquer all. So if you're ready for a story that will make you believe in justice again, if you want to see what happens when the underdog finally gets her day, then make sure you subscribe and turn on those notifications. Because I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll never look at first impressions the same way again. And you'll understand why sometimes the most powerful weapon against cruelty is simply telling the truth. 3 years ago, my life was as predictable as clockwork. Wake up at 5, get Emma ready for school, drop her off, rush to my morning shift at Peterson's Insurance, then straight to Mel's Diner for the dinner rush, every single day. The diner job was my lifeline, because the tips made the difference between paying rent and choosing between electricity or groceries. I remember that Tuesday like it was yesterday, because it was the day everything changed, though I had no idea at the time. I was wiping down table 6 when this man walked in, and honestly, he looked completely out of place. Designer suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. But there was something about his eyes that seemed so tired, so lonely. He didn't have that arrogant swagger you'd expect from someone with money. He sat in my section, booth 12 by the window, and ordered the simplest thing on the menu. Black coffee and a slice of apple pie, that was it. Most customers barely looked at me, treating me like I was invisible, but this man actually made eye contact when he said thank you. There was something genuine about it that caught me off guard. What really struck me was how he ate, slowly, like he had nowhere else to be, staring out that window like he was lost in some deep thought. I'd seen plenty of lonely people come through those doors, but this was different. This was someone who had everything money could buy, but seemed to have lost something much more valuable. When I brought his check, he asked me about the drawing Emma had made, that I kept tucked in my apron pocket. It was just a silly crayon picture of our little apartment, but I'd kept it because it made her so proud. He smiled when I showed it to him, the first real smile I'd seen from him, and said it reminded him that some of the most beautiful things in life cost absolutely nothing. Then came the moment that nearly made my heart stop. He left a $500 tip on a $7 check. I ran after him, thinking it was a mistake, but he was already gone. All I found was a note tucked under his coffee cup that said, "For Emma's art supplies, real talent should never go to waste." I stood there in that empty diner, holding more money than I'd seen in months, wondering who this mysterious man was, and why he cared about a little girl he'd never met. Little did I know, that simple act of kindness was about to turn my entire world upside down. The next Tuesday, I kept glancing at the door, wondering if he'd come back. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that rich men like him probably had a dozen different restaurants they rotated through. But at exactly 6:30, there he was again. Same booth, same order. This time, though, he stayed longer. His name was Marcus Wellington, and when he told me, I nearly dropped my coffee pot. Everyone in town knew that name from the business section of the newspaper. Wellington Tech had put our little city on the map, employing half the people I knew. But sitting there in his slightly wrinkled shirt, asking me about my day like it actually mattered, he didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like someone who'd forgotten how to connect with people and was desperately trying to remember. The third Tuesday, he brought Emma a small easel. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden one from the art store downtown. When I picked her up from daycare and showed it to her, she squealed so loud that every parent in the parking lot turned to look. That night, she painted a picture of three people holding hands under a rainbow, and I knew without asking that the tall figure in the middle was supposed to be Marcus. What amazed me wasn't his generosity, though. It was how he listened. When I told him about Emma's fear of thunderstorms, he didn't just nod politely. The next week, he brought her a book about a brave little girl who befriended storm clouds. When I mentioned that my car was making weird noises, he casually asked if I'd mind if his mechanic took a look at it. No big deal, he said, just someone he trusted. The shift happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice it. Our conversations stretched longer each week. He'd ask about Emma's latest artwork, and I'd find myself asking about his day, his work, his life. He told me about growing up with parents who measured love in stock options, about a marriage that ended in tragedy, about how he'd built an empire but somehow lost himself in the process. 2 months in, he asked if Emma and I would like to have dinner with him somewhere other than the diner. Not at some fancy restaurant, he was quick to clarify, but maybe at the park where Emma could play while we talked. I said yes before I could overthink it, and watching him push my daughter on the swings while she giggled uncontrollably, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The dangerous kind that makes you believe fairy tales might actually come true. 6 months later, Marcus asked me to meet him at Riverside Park, Emma's favorite spot, where the old oak trees created a natural cathedral of branches. I thought it was just another one of our weekend picnics, but there was something different about him that day. He seemed nervous, which was strange, because I'd never seen Marcus Wellington nervous about anything. Emma was feeding the ducks when he took my hand and said he needed to tell me something important. My heart started racing, but not in a good way. In my experience, when men said they needed to tell you something important, it usually meant they were leaving. I braced myself for the speech about how this had been fun, but he needed to focus on his business, or how he'd realized we were from different worlds. Instead, he told me he'd been dead inside for years before he met us, that watching me work 2 jobs with a smile on my face, seeing how Emma could find joy in a puddle or a dandelion, had reminded him what it felt like to be alive. He said Emma and I had saved him in ways I couldn't possibly understand, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life trying to give us even a fraction of the happiness we'd given him. Then he got down on one knee, and I swear my heart stopped beating entirely. But here's the part that still makes me cry thinking about it. Before he even looked at me, he turned to Emma and asked for her permission to marry her mommy. My 6-year-old daughter looked at this powerful man kneeling in the grass, put her tiny hands on his cheeks, and said, "You make mommy smile the real smile." So yes. The ring was beautiful, but not flashy. A simple solitaire that caught the light like captured starlight. He'd remembered how I'd once told him I hated when people showed off, how I thought love should whisper, not shout. As he slipped it onto my finger, he said something that I'd replay in my mind during the darkest days to come. "Sarah, you and Emma are the only real thing in my life. Everything else is just noise." I said yes through tears I couldn't control, and Emma tackled us both in a hug that knocked us flat onto the grass, lying there, laughing like children. I truly believed we were going to live happily ever after. I should have known that fairy tales always have dragons. The Wellington family mansion sat on 50 acres outside the city, the kind of place you see in magazines, but never imagine actually stepping foot in. As Marcus drove us up the winding driveway, Emma pressed her face to the window and whispered, "It's like a castle, Mommy." I wished I could share her excitement, but my stomach was churning with anxiety. Marcus had warned me that his family could be difficult, but I thought that meant they'd be politely distant, maybe a little snobbish. I wasn't prepared for the Arctic freeze that hit us the moment we walked through those massive front doors. His mother, Eleanor, a silver-haired woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a society portrait, offered me the kind of smile people give to unwelcome door-to-door salespeople. His brother David was worse. He looked me up and down, like he was appraising livestock, his eyes lingering on my department store dress, with obvious distaste. When Marcus introduced Emma, David barely glanced at her, before turning away to fix himself another drink. The message was clear: we didn't belong here, and we never would. But it was his sister Victoria who really showed me what I was up against. Beautiful in that cold porcelain way that money could buy, she glided over with perfectly manicured nails and a voice like poisoned honey. "So you're the waitress," she said, managing to make it sound like a communicable disease. "How fascinating that you managed to catch Marcus's attention. You must have some very special skills." The dinner conversation was a masterclass in polite cruelty. Every question was designed to highlight how different I was, how little I belonged in their world. Where did I go to college? What did my parents do? Did I have any experience managing household staff? When I mentioned that I'd worked since I was 16 to help support my mom after my dad left, Eleanor actually winced like I'd said something vulgar. The worst part was how they talked around me, as if I wasn't even there. Victoria mentioned how gold diggers had become so common these days, how tragic it was when wealthy men fell prey to women who saw dollar signs instead of love. David nodded along, adding that prenups were essential in this day and age to protect family assets from opportunistic outsiders. Through it all, Marcus grew quieter and more tense. I could see the muscle in his jaw twitching as he listened to his family's thinly veiled attacks. When Eleanor suggested Emma might be more comfortable eating in the kitchen with the staff, something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Marcus insisted on a small ceremony, despite his family's pressure for a grand society wedding. He said he wanted our day to be about love, not spectacle. And honestly, I was relieved. The thought of walking down an aisle filled with hundreds of people who saw me as a gold digger made my skin crawl. We got married in the same park where he proposed, under those oak trees that had witnessed our beginning. Emma was my maid of honor in a yellow dress that made her look like sunshine, and Marcus's best friend from college officiated. It should have been perfect, and in many ways it was. When Marcus said his vows about finding his home in my heart, there wasn't a dry eye in our small gathering. But even on our wedding day, the Wellington family found ways to cast shadows. Eleanor wore black, claiming it was her favorite color, though everyone knew what message she was really sending. Victoria arrived late, making a grand entrance during the ceremony, her heels clicking loudly against the stone walkway as she found her seat. The reception was held at Marcus's penthouse, intimate and beautiful, with fairy lights and Emma's artwork displayed like precious paintings. That's when David stood up to give his toast, and my blood ran cold. He smiled that politician's smile and raised his glass, talking about family tradition and hoping that Marcus had chosen wisely. Then came the knife thrust, disguised as a blessing. May this union bring Marcus the happiness he deserves, and may he always remember that true love isn't measured by what we can gain, but by what we're willing to give. The room went silent. Everyone knew what he really meant, and I felt every eye on me, judging, calculating, wondering what I'd gained by marrying into the Wellington fortune. I wanted to disappear, but Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor like a gunshot. "Since we're talking about what people deserve," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, Let me be crystal clear about something. Sarah deserves a family that welcomes her with open arms, not one that treats her like a threat. Emma deserves relatives who see her as a blessing, not an inconvenience. And I deserve better than watching the people I love be insulted at my own wedding. The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went red. Victoria looked like she'd been slapped. And Eleanor stared into her champagne glass like it held the secrets of the universe. But Marcus wasn't finished. Moving into Marcus's penthouse should have felt like a dream come true. And in many ways, it did. Emma had her own art studio, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And watching her paint with supplies that cost more than my monthly rent still felt surreal. Marcus would come home from 12-hour days, running his empire, and immediately get on the floor to play tea party or help with homework, never once acting like it was beneath him. But the fairy tale had cracks that grew wider every day. The Wellington family might have been forced to accept our marriage, but they made sure I knew I'd never truly belong. Family gatherings became exercises in psychological warfare, with Eleanor making comments about how difficult it must be for me to adjust to our way of life, and Victoria asking if I needed help learning proper etiquette for charity events. The worst part was how they treated Emma. She was just a child, but they acted like she was some kind of infection that might spread if they got too close. At Marcus's birthday dinner, Victoria actually moved her purse when Emma sat down next to her, as if my daughter might contaminate it. When Emma proudly showed Eleanor a painting she'd made of our new family, his mother glanced at it for exactly 2 seconds before handing it back and saying, "How nice, dear. Perhaps you could hang it in your room." The social circle was even worse. These were people who'd known Marcus for decades, who'd attended his first wedding, who'd watched him retreat from the world after his wife died. They saw me as an opportunist who'd swooped in during his moment of weakness. At gallery openings and charity galas, conversations would stop when I approached, then resume in whispers after I passed. The breaking point came at the Children's Hospital fundraiser, an event Marcus had supported for years. I was standing by the silent auction, trying to look like I belonged, when a woman in diamonds that probably cost more than most people's houses approached me. She smiled that same poisonous smile I'd learned to recognize and said, "You know, everyone's talking about how clever you are, finding a grieving widower, bringing along a cute child for extra sympathy points. It's almost like a playbook." I excused myself and locked myself in the bathroom, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. That's where Marcus found me 20 minutes later, mascara streaked down my face, wondering if maybe his family was right about me after all. 2 years into our marriage, Marcus started getting tired more easily. At first, I thought it was just the stress of running a billion-dollar company and dealing with his family's constant disapproval of me. He'd come home exhausted, sometimes falling asleep on the couch while Emma showed him her latest artwork. But then came the night he collapsed in our kitchen while making her breakfast. The diagnosis hit us like a freight train: hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a rare condition that had been silently weakening his heart for years. The doctors explained it in terms I barely understood, but the bottom line was crystal clear. Without a transplant, Marcus had maybe 2 years left. My world shattered into a million pieces right there in that sterile hospital room. But if I thought his illness might bring his family together, or maybe even generate some sympathy for what we were going through, I was devastatingly wrong. Within hours of the diagnosis, David was already making comments about how convenient this was for me, how I'd be a very wealthy widow soon. Victoria actually had the audacity to suggest that Marcus should consider revising his will while he was still of sound mind, just to protect the family interests. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. Marcus tried to maintain his normal routine, but I could see him fading a little more each day. I became his caregiver, his protector, his fiercest advocate. I learned to read his medication schedule like a prayer book, to recognize the signs when he needed rest, to smile and pretend everything was fine when Emma was around, because we both agreed she was too young to understand how serious this was. Through it all, his family treated my devotion like an elaborate performance. When I'd rush home from Emma's school play to give Marcus his evening medication, Eleanor would make snide comments about how attentive I'd become. When I hired the best cardiac specialists money could buy, David questioned whether I was just trying to look good for appearances. The cruelest moment came when I overheard Victoria on the phone telling someone how tragic it was that Marcus's gold-digging wife would probably inherit everything, and how unfair it was to the family members who'd actually loved him his whole life. I was in the hallway, carrying his dinner tray because he'd been too weak to come to the table, and her words hit me like physical blows. But Marcus, even in his weakening state, never stopped defending us. Even when it took tremendous effort, he'd still read Emma bedtime stories every single night. The last month of Marcus's life was a blur of hospital visits, experimental treatments, and watching the strongest man I'd ever known slowly fade away. His condition deteriorated rapidly that winter, and by February, we all knew the end was coming. The doctors had stopped talking about treatment options and started discussing comfort care. But even as Marcus grew weaker, his family's vulture-like behavior only intensified. They started showing up at the hospital daily, not to comfort him or spend precious time together, but to hover around like they were waiting for something. David would corner doctors in hallways, asking questions about Marcus's mental state and decision-making capacity. Victoria brought legal documents that she claimed were just routine business matters, but always seemed to involve signatures and witnesses. The breaking point came when Eleanor suggested that maybe Emma and I should stay home during Marcus's final days so that his real family could have some private time with him. Marcus was barely conscious, but he heard her. His eyes snapped open with more fire than I'd seen in weeks, and he told his mother in no uncertain terms that Sarah and Emma were his real family, and if they weren't welcome, then nobody was. 2 days before he died, Marcus asked me to call his lawyer, Robert Chen, for a private meeting. The family immediately went into panic mode, assuming he was cutting them out of his will entirely. David actually tried to block Mr. Chen from entering Marcus's hospital room, claiming his brother wasn't in any condition to make legal decisions. But Marcus was lucid that day, more alert than he'd been in weeks, and he made it clear this meeting was happening whether they liked it or not. I never found out what they discussed during that hour-long meeting. Marcus was exhausted afterward, but there was something peaceful about his expression, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. When I asked if everything was okay, he squeezed my hand and said, "They never understood what real treasure looks like, Sarah, but you will." On his last day, Marcus was barely conscious, but Emma crawled up onto his hospital bed and tucked one of her latest drawings under his arm. It was a picture of him with angel wings, standing in a beautiful garden. With tremendous effort, he opened his eyes one last time, looked at both of us, and whispered, "Take care of each other." Then he was gone, and my world went dark. Marcus's funeral was everything he would have hated. Eleanor insisted on a grand ceremony at the city's most prestigious cathedral, complete with a full orchestra and enough flowers to fill a greenhouse. The guest list read like a who's who of business leaders, politicians, and old money families. Everyone who mattered in high society was there, dressed in their finest black attire, ready to pay their respects to one of the city's most influential men. I sat in the front pew with Emma, who clutched the program with Marcus's photo on it like it was a lifeline. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew her stepdad wasn't coming home, and that was enough to break my heart all over again. The Wellington family sat beside us, playing their roles perfectly. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Victoria looked appropriately somber in her designer morning dress, and David delivered a eulogy that painted Marcus as a devoted son and brother who would be deeply missed. But I could feel the whispers rippling through the congregation behind us. People leaning in to share observations about how young I looked in my simple black dress, how convenient it was that Marcus had died so soon after our marriage, how that little girl wasn't even his real daughter. The weight of their judgment pressed down on me like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe in that massive cathedral. After the service, people approached me with their condolences, but I could see the calculation in their eyes. They were already wondering what would happen to the Wellington fortune, whether I'd be smart enough to disappear quietly, or foolish enough to fight for what Marcus had left me. Some were more direct, mentioning how difficult it must be for such a young widow to navigate these complicated family dynamics, suggesting that perhaps it would be best for everyone if I considered my options carefully. Eleanor announced that the will reading would take place immediately following the reception, a departure from normal practice, but one she claimed Marcus had specifically requested. As we drove from the cemetery to the Wellington mansion, Emma fell asleep against my shoulder, exhausted from the day's emotions. I stared out at the gray February sky and wondered what Marcus had meant about treasure. Whatever he'd arranged with his lawyer, whatever final gift or burden he'd left for me, I was about to find out. The vultures were circling, and I was walking straight into their nest. The Wellington family library had always intimidated me, with its floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves and leather-bound first editions that probably cost more than most people's cars. But that afternoon, it felt like a courtroom where I was about to be sentenced. Eleanor sat behind Marcus's massive desk like a queen holding court, while David and Victoria flanked her like loyal generals. Various cousins, business associates, and longtime family friends filled the remaining chairs, all waiting to see how the Wellington fortune would be divided. Robert Chen, Marcus's lawyer, looked uncomfortable as he arranged his papers. He'd been the family attorney for over 20 years, and I could tell this wasn't going to be a typical reading. Emma sat beside me, swinging her legs and coloring in a book, blissfully unaware that everyone in this room saw her as an obstacle to their inheritance. Mr. Chen began with the standard legal language, his voice formal and measured. The first bequests were predictable: generous donations to Marcus's favorite charities, substantial gifts to longtime employees, and trust funds for various cousins. Eleanor received the family's historical properties and jewelry collection. David inherited a significant stake in Wellington Tech's international holdings. Victoria got the art collection and several investment portfolios. With each bequest, I felt the room's attention shifting toward me with barely contained anticipation. They were all waiting for the big moment, probably expecting Marcus to have left me some modest widow's pension that would send me quietly back to my old life. I could see it in their faces, the assumption that I'd gotten what little I deserved and would now disappear from their world forever. Then Mr. Chen's voice took on a different tone. "To my beloved wife Sarah and my cherished daughter Emma," he began, and the room went completely silent. "I leave the remainder of my estate, including all controlling interests in Wellington Tech, the penthouse, and all liquid assets, totaling approximately $2.8 billion. The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went completely white. Victoria's mouth dropped open like she'd been physically struck. Eleanor gripped the arms of her chair so tightly, her knuckles went bone white. But Mr. Chen wasn't finished. However, he continued, pulling out a sealed envelope. Marcus also left specific instructions that I read this letter aloud to everyone present. He said it was important that his family understand his reasoning. My heart started pounding as I realized this was it. This was Marcus's final gift, his last protection. Mr. Chen opened the sealed envelope with hands that trembled slightly, and I could tell that even he didn't know what Marcus had written. As he began to read, his voice grew stronger, as if Marcus himself was speaking through him from beyond the grave. "To my family, who never understood what love actually means, and to Sarah, who saved my life without even knowing it, there are things you need to know about how this story really began." The room was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. Emma had stopped coloring and was looking around at all the frozen faces, sensing something important was happening, even if she didn't understand what. Sarah doesn't know this, but I'd been coming to Mel's diner every Tuesday for 2 years before I ever spoke to her. I wasn't there for the food. I was there because I'd made a decision that my life wasn't worth living anymore, and I was building up the courage to end it. My blood turned to ice. The room began to spin as I realized what Marcus was saying, what he'd never told me about those early visits to the diner. I would sit in my car in that parking lot every week, pills in my pocket, watching through the window as this remarkable woman worked 2 jobs with a smile on her face. I watched her play with her daughter during breaks, saw how she treated every customer with kindness, even when they were rude to her. I watched her count tips at the end of her shift, sometimes crying when they weren't enough, but always getting up the next day to try again. David's face had gone from white to gray. Victoria was staring at the lawyer like he was speaking a foreign language. Eleanor had covered her mouth with her hands. That woman, that beautiful single mother who my family has spent 3 years calling a gold digger, literally saved my life every Tuesday for 2 years before I found the courage to walk through those doors and speak to her. She had no idea that watching her live with such grace and determination was the only thing keeping me alive. The letter went on, Marcus's voice reaching across death to defend the woman he loved. Sarah never pursued me. I pursued her desperately because she reminded me what it meant to be human. She never asked for anything except love, and she gave me more joy in 3 years than I'd had in the previous 20. But Marcus wasn't finished. Mr. Chen continued reading, and with each word, I felt the power dynamic in that room shifting completely. As for my family, who spent 3 years making the woman I love feel unwelcome in her own home, who treated an innocent child like she was somehow less worthy of love because she wasn't born a Wellington, I want you to know that I heard every cruel word, saw every cold shoulder, witnessed every moment you tried to make them feel small. Victoria had gone completely pale. David was staring at his hands like they held the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Eleanor looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. David, your inheritance is contingent upon one condition. You will treat Sarah and Emma with the respect and love they deserve, or you will forfeit everything. Victoria, the same applies to you. Mother, I'm hoping that knowing the truth about how Sarah saved your son's life might finally open your heart to the family that brought me back from the brink. Then came the part that made me gasp out loud. And because I know my family well enough to predict they won't believe this letter, I had my assistant install recording devices in the main rooms of the penthouse and family properties over the past year. Mr. Chin has copies of every conversation, every cruel comment, every moment you thought no one was listening. The silence that followed was absolute. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Victoria looked like she was going to be sick. Eleanor just sat there, tears streaming down her face as the full weight of what Marcus was saying hit her. Sarah, the letter continued, and Mr. Chen's voice grew gentler. You gave me a reason to live when I'd forgotten what joy felt like. Emma, you taught me that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up with love every single day. Use this money to build the life you deserve, free from people who never learned to see your worth. As Mr. Chen folded the letter, the room remained frozen. Then something unexpected happened. Eleanor stood up slowly, walked over to where Emma and I were sitting, and dropped to her knees in front of my daughter. Emma, she whispered, her voice breaking. Would you forgive a foolish old woman who forgot how to recognize an angel when she saw one? Emma looked at me with those wise 6-year-old eyes, then wrapped her little arms around Marcus's mother and said, Angels always forgive, Grandma Eleanor. That's what makes us angels. The transformation in that room was immediate and absolute. Marcus had won his final battle, and love had triumphed over cruelty in the most perfect way possible.